Good afternoon. We're experiencing a little technical difficulties, but CCTV is working on it so we can hear from our Congresswoman Catherine Clark. Um, Thank you for joining us for Black Cambridge and COVID-19. And we will look to CCTV and our tech to cue us when Congresswoman Clark is ready to be presented.
And thank you, Manika. Welcome, folks. Welcome to COVID-19 and the Black community. This is a series of conversations that my colleague and very good friend, and I often say Shiro, Manikka Bowman, have been hosting back since May. You know, as we sat hunkered down in our homes and watched the impact of COVID-19 on our communities, Manika suggested, and I had been thinking about, how do we get out to the community and talk about some of the issues that are impacting us? And so we reached out to CCTV, and they were wonderful, wonderful. They said, yes, I think it's a great idea. Why don't we would be more than glad. And why don't you host a series of discussions on COVID-19 and its impact on the Black community? And so we did. And so back in May, it doesn't seem like it's that long ago, we launched our first discussion about COVID-19 and its impact on the Black community. And we started, very interestingly enough, on education. And we had some educational leaders from across the District of Cambridge to talk about how COVID-19 was impacting our kids before the pandemic. Now, as the pandemic was continuing on, and what kinds of things could we do? So it's quite interesting that we would be back after a short hiatus having that conversation as we're thinking about reopening schools. And as I said earlier, we've been at this since May, and some of the topics that we talked about over that period, we talked about the COVID-19 and its impact on the Black, Brown community, business community. We had an intergenerational conversation on COVID-19 and how it was impacting the Black community. We also talked about, we actually, right in the middle of all of that, we had a discussion on women's suffrage because we were celebrating or acknowledging, we didn't even call it a celebration, we called it an acknowledgement of women's suffrage, because although suffrage came to women 100 years ago, it would be 45 years later with the Civil Rights Act that Black women would actually get suffrage. And so we used this platform again in CCTV to have those really important discussions with our community, not only to share information, but connect people. And so now we're back. And this started as a series of 6 programs. And popular demand, I said, no, don't stop, continue to have these discussions. So right after that, we had a discussion about COVID-19. The storm is not over. And in that one, we talked about the impact the COVID-19 virus was having still on the African American community. Even though in our city of Cambridge, the numbers are very low, African Americans are 30% of the cases that we see. And why is that? Also, during the time we were having that conversation, those series of conversations, John Lewis, the lion, when it comes to freedom, civil rights, and equal justice, passed away. And so when we came back to have that discussion on the storm not being over, it was not just the pandemic, it was our rights and our fight for racial equality and fairness. And so with that, Monique and I said these conversations were going to be our way of having some good trouble. As John Lewis would say, we're starting some good trouble here. So I am just so pleased to be back after a short break with my colleague and friend, Manikka Bowman, and we have with us 2 other outstanding individuals who are going to be talking with us as we discuss COVID-19 reopening schools. It's a cross-municipal discussion. Now, only Manikka would think of this. And so I thought it was extraordinarily important because we're not in this fight by ourselves. this really has statewide, nationwide implications. So to bring our esteemed colleagues from across these geographical lines, I think is not only important, but timely. So before we launch into the depth of our conversation, I'm going to ask my co-host and moderator to say a few words, and then she's going to kind of slip back in the role of participant. I hope if she wants to, because she doesn't have to. But just to say a few words, by way of introduction, and then we're going to come back to our speakers who are going to talk a little bit about themselves, and then we're going to launch in with a question. So tune in, ask your questions into the chat feature so that we can make sure your voice is heard as well. Manikka, please.
Thank you, Denise, and it's always a pleasure to host these with you. You know, it's no secret that over the past few months, particularly school committees have been on really the front line of this conversation as it relates to reopening schools. Unfortunately, at the state level, a lot of decisions were pushed down to people like myself and my colleagues to figure out what makes sense for our own communities as it relates to educating our children and ensuring the safety of our families and our educators. It was a very challenging place to be in. And I thought it was just really important for us to have a conversation across municipalities to understand the complexities and the nuances that were involved in the decision making. I also realized that, Cambridge is in a really interesting place. We spend close to 30,000 per pupil. And our ability to put certain things in place to tackle this crisis is very different from other municipalities. And I just think, particularly from a Cambridge context, it's really important to be in conversations with other individuals that may not have that particular pot of resources that we do and hear how they're tackling these issues. So I am elated that my colleagues agreed to be a part of this conversation with me. I also want to just acknowledge Fern Fergus, who is from the Sharon School Committee. Unfortunately, was not able to join us and sends her regrets to our panel and to our viewing audience today. I'm ready to get into the conversation, but we're going to try one more time to figure out how to make sure that our beloved Congresswoman KATHERINE Clark, can address us this afternoon before we get the conversation started. So I'm handing it back over to CCTV.
Hi, I'm Congresswoman KATHERINE Clark. Over the last 6 months, our communities have endured so much stress, hardship, and heartache. And here we are, yet again, confronting another difficult task. How do we safely educate our children? This challenge touches so many in our community. Parents, kids, teachers, administrators, janitorial staff, cafeteria crews, bus drivers, parents, employers, and doctors. And right in the middle of all of it are school committee members like you. We know that these issues disproportionately affect Black and Brown students and families. And because of the vacuum of leadership from our country's highest office, we don't have all the information or tools necessary to know the exact right way to move forward. But we do know this: parents want what's best for their children. Teachers want to teach, and you, our school committee members, want to keep everyone as safe as possible. Every stakeholder involved in this discussion wants to move toward a solution that benefits all and protects our most vulnerable. We are all on the same team, working toward the same goal, and thanks to your leadership and compassion, we will find a way forward. I'm in Washington right now, fighting for the funding and resources our communities need in order to tackle the complex challenges of this pandemic. But I remember what it was like serving on the Melrose School Committee, trying to make best decisions for our community with whatever resources we were given. Your jobs are so difficult, even in the best of times, and these are certainly not the best of times. So I just want to say thank you. Your commitment to our children and our community inspires me, and I hope you will consider me and my office a resource as we work to ensure that every student remains safe and supported, and that we build a better future based on inclusion, opportunity, and justice for all. Thank you.
Well, a great big shout out and thank you to Congresswoman KATHERINE Clark for her opening remarks. And I mean, I'm glad she said she was a member of the Melrose School Committee, because I had forgotten. I mean, she has been in Congress, first the State House and then Congress for such a long time. I've forgotten her beginnings, which I think is, when I think of city service and municipal service, I think school committees are ground zero. They are the bedrock of city services. And so I want to thank my colleague, but I also my colleagues in other cities and towns that join us today for being here today. So let's get started. Why don't we just begin by a brief introduction of our panelists, because I know we may know all of you, but some may be tuning in for the first time. In fact, our chat is hot and popping. We already have a question. But I want us to open up just by saying who we are, you know, your terms of service, what brought you to the school committee. So please give your full names, and we'll start with TAMIKA and then Andre, and then to my colleague Manikka. Just a little bit about who you are, who your terms of service, and what brought you to the school committee. TAMIKA?
Hi, thank you, Denise. So my name is TAMIKA OLSZEWSKI, and I'm in my very first term as a member of the Newton School Committee. I represent Ward 4. We are ward-based in Newton. There are 8 members of the committee, as well as the mayor, who sits ex officio. So I am a member of the Newton Human Rights Commission and an executive member of Forge, Families Organizing for Racial Justice, and the Harmony Foundation, which are 2 Newton-based organizations entirely devoted to promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. I'm also one of the founding members of the Newton Coalition of Black Residents. I'm an attorney by profession and the mother of 10-year-old twins. And I think in answer to how I came to the school committee, I think it was the merger of some of the advocacy that I'd been doing for the schools with a desire to make, you know, the school district that my kids go to as welcoming, as strong, as supportive as it can be for all of our students. So thank you, Denise, and thank you, Manikka, for having me.
And thank you for joining us. So Andre, please tell us a little bit about yourself and your service.
Hi, I'm Andre Green. I serve on the Somerville School Committee, where I have served since 2016. Like TAMIKA, we do a ward-based system in Somerville, so I also represent Ward 4. And as far as what brings me to the school committee, the short answer is I'm a first-generation college student. Public education saved my life. I had been active in the community, most notably, I also was a member of the Somerville Human Rights Commission at the time, as a board member for the Welcome Project, which does immigrant services in Somerville and beyond. And when my predecessor decided she was going to leave the school committee, there was a real search for a progressive advocate of color, honestly, because Somerville has historically, and not to say historically, currently has deep issues with representation for people of color. I am the second person of color to serve on the Somerville School Committee in the history of the city, the only one currently serving in 177 years in a district that is 60% students of color. So whether I wanted to or not, the issues of diversity, equity, inclusion were always going to be central to my service. I also have 20 years of working in the nonprofit sector, usually around issues of education, anti-poverty, and particularly intergenerational poverty. So that's the lens I bring to this work.
Wow, and thank you for joining us today. Manikka, it's not last but not least, but last and as important, I know many people, if not everybody knows you here in Cambridge, but we have a very great diverse audience with us today because of the cultural, cross-municipal conversation. So there's some people that are joining us that may not know you as well. So please take this opportunity to introduce yourselves or reintroduce yourselves to our audience. Manikka.
Yes, thank you, Denise. So I am the vice chair of the Cambridge School Committee. I got elected in 2016. Yeah, I decided to run in 2015. And I'm the second senior member of the school committee, if you can believe that right now, in such a short amount of time. I decided to run because I've always had a passion for public life. I grew up in Lake Charles, Louisiana, which has recently been devastated by hurricanes. But when I was there, I watched my childhood pastor also very active in public life. He became a city councilor. And so at a very young age, I was like, oh, I want to do that. I want to operate at the intersection of the moral voice and public life. And so I went on, got joint master's degrees in urban policy and divinity, and started my career really trying to figure out, how do I create space for myself? The people that I looked up to, him, Andrew Young, Dr. Martin Luther King, all of those people allowed their faith to empower them in the public arena. The difference I discovered between me and those people was I was a woman, right? And it kind of works a little different for females, particularly in those two spaces. I joke around and say I really chose some very challenging career options as a woman, but I'm pleased that the city of Cambridge has accepted me and chose me to lead, particularly in these very challenging times. So thank you to the city of Cambridge for trusting me in these very difficult circumstances.
And thank you, Manikka. I'm sure you hear it, all of you, thank you, but probably not enough, because what we all know in public service, if you're doing it for the thanks, don't wait by the mailbox. It's very, very hard work, but I can tell from what you've told me about yourselves, or what I already know, is that you didn't do it for the thanks. You did it for the belief that you have in public schools and public education. And that's why we're having this conversation today. So here we are. We're steeped in COVID-19, and school committees across Massachusetts have been steeped in activity about how do we reopen our schools. And I know all of you from your background have been looking at that through the lens of race and equity. So here you are. None of you had any summer at all, meeting. If you've been anything like what I've seen Cambridge do, there's meetings every other week on one or the other aspect. And then the final decision. How do we safely reopen schools? So I want to pose this question to each of you. So as you're thinking about your school reopening model, here's 3 things I want you to address. What's the model? What is your model? What was your school committee vote on that model? And what were the COVID-19 transmission rates for the reopening plan vote? And how are they now? I mean, that's a lot. So how you want to approach that in any particular order? But we're trying to look at, what did you decide after the months? And you may want to talk a little bit about how long it took you to get there, but what is the decision? How are your schools going to reopen? What was that vote? What is your positivity rates in your schools? So anyone can jump in, or, as I have always said, if you don't jump in, I'm going to call on you. Going, Manikka?
Okay, I can start it off like the home team, right? Cambridge. So in Cambridge, we decided for a partial in-person model. So our K through 3rd grade will have an opt-in option for students, while our 4th through 12th grade will be remote. Within the 4th and 12th grades, there will be opportunities for some form of in-person, but that will be targeted towards our most vulnerable students. Our reopening plan passed unanimously with our school committee, and when we made the plan, our goal was to move forward with that with our school opening, which would be September 16th. However, we had to take a step back, and we realized if we really wanted to meet the needs of our community, as well as be sensitive to what it takes to actually implement an in-person program under these really challenging circumstances, we may need to give our principals and our educators more space and time to really be able to meet the needs of our community. So our in-person programming is actually starting next month, October 13th. Our discussion around how we even made it to our model of our K through third grade in person and the 4th through 12th being remote, really was shaped significantly by our task force. We had a COVID-19 task force that worked directly with our school superintendent. We had parents, educators were on the task force, and we had scientific leaders, epidemiologists that volunteered their time for weeks to help us figure out how to approach this task. And we put in metrics when the state was not positioned to give us any guidance, quite frankly, on how to define safety. I'm very proud that our task force and our scientists, worked with our administration to come up with a framework that we have put in place that's attached to our model. So we have 3 metrics. One is the weighted average per new case per day, and we want to make sure that that is under 25% per day. The second metric is looking at the positivity rate across Massachusetts, and the goal is to make sure that that is below 5%. And the third metric is really having the ability to monitor wastewater systems within our city. Evidently, that is new technology and innovation that would give us an insight on the trajectory of COVID-19. When we took our vote, our weighted average of positivity rate was right about 3.6%. Now, currently in the city of Cambridge, our average positivity rate over a 14-day average is under 1%. So, we're really in a very interesting place to move forward with the program that we put in place, our K through third grade model and our 4th through 12th grade remote learning. And I'm really grateful for the city of Cambridge. As I walk around my community, even when people have no one around them, people are wearing masks here. And I think the dedication of our residents have positioned our school committee and our families to be able to even be in a position to go back and serve the needs of our kids. So thank you to the city of Cambridge for taking this really seriously.
Thanks, Manikka. That's a lot of information, and it really is sort of indicative of all the work that the City of Cambridge School Committee and I would say stakeholders have really been putting in terms of time. Let me go to you, Andre. You sit right there as our sister city in Somerville. What have you guys done? Again, what is your model? What is your positivity rate? Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Sure. As many of you may know, Somerville has made news since the beginning of this crisis for forging its own path. Our mayor has been notably more conservative than the state has been. I think, by and large, correctly. I think we were leading in a time when the state, as I'm sure we'll discuss in great detail over this next hour, has not been. So our buildings so all of Somerville municipal buildings remain closed. And that's in part because although our schools are our best shaped buildings, frankly speaking, the decision was made correctly that they're not ready for prime time yet. That's not in this. So we are starting remotely with what we're calling a phased hybrid approach, where the hope is that as the buildings get online, as testing becomes more widespread and available, including, like in Cambridge, the wastewater testing, we will start by bringing in our special education and English language students, then our pre-K, first, second, and third graders, and then everyone. I say, and then everyone with one caveat. We are also currently finishing up the current stage of construction of a new high school. Until such time that school is ready to go online, which we're hoping will now be December-ish, the high school cannot be reopened. To put it in context, the existing Somerville High School, which is 100 and 26 years old, I think now, has one suite of student bathrooms for 1,300 students. So the idea of washing student hands in a way that was, feasible for this is just not possible. So this is say nothing of the HVAC, which doesn't work, any of that stuff. So the high school will be remote until the new building is ready to be used. That being said, the other thing Somerville, I think, did differently than a lot of other communities was how we introduced our reopening plan. A lot of cities and towns, the superintendent proposed a plan, the school committee approved it, and then negotiations with the union began. In Somerville, we started the negotiations with the union before the superintendent produced a plan. The plan that was produced by the superintendent and then voted out unanimously by the school committee took into consideration the status of those negotiations and the framework therein, which I believe is one of the reasons why we are one of the few districts that, as we look at this starting school for us to start school on Friday, we have a signed MOA with the teachers union. That does not mean that we are done planning, as anyone who's been doing this work knows that because the pandemic is a moving target, our response is also a moving target. So things like when are we going back are still being discussed. We like Cambridge have had a health and environmental safety committee that is got representatives of the school district, the city, parents, the relative union, city and school side, and that has been meeting for months. There's negotiations that even though we have a signed MOU, I'm on the bargaining team and we still met with the union for 3 hours on Thursday. We'll continue to do so. So a lot of people have put a lot of work into this, have been for, since March, to be honest. And like Cambridge, actually, some of those numbers are right now fairly low. We have a 2-week average positivity rate of 0.71%. It is at its highest, it was in the 2s. Somerville is in part because we have been more aggressive, and Somerville is still in phase 2, like most of the state, which is in phase 3 of reopening. So our numbers have been low, but we are also very mindful of the reality that almost all of our teachers and staff come from other communities, right? And they come from communities like Chelsea, which has been devastated by COVID. They come from communities like Revere and Lynn, which have not seen the numbers that Somerville and Cambridge have. And of course, all of this, and Cambridge probably knows this better than any city, is also against the backdrop of the college students are coming back. Like Tufts is committed to fully reopening. We don't know yet that that's going to do our numbers. We all heard the news out of Northeastern about the 11 students they kicked out. So I think Somerville's approach, and it's what I think is the correct one for Somerville, has been to lean into the uncertainty and not to try to give numbers or metrics or dates that we don't think we can live up to, which as a parent, deeply frustrating, right? I want the certainty. I want to know when my kids are going back to school. But I think given where Somerville is, I think it's the only real reasonable path we can take forward.
Thank you, and Andre. But something that you said, and I just want to go back to, because you said you were starting remotely, and then I heard Friday. And so are you starting remotely in Somerville on Friday the 18th of September? Is that the plan?
Yes, Friday the 18th is our first day of school for this year, and it will be fully remote. Okay,
excellent. Okay, Tamika, let's hear from you. What are they doing in Newton in terms of what's your model? How did your school committee vote on this? What's the plan of action? What's your numbers?
So we have arrived at a unanimous vote by way of a pretty, not rocky path, but it wasn't a linear path. So I'm going to kind of give you an overview of where we started and where we are now. On August 10th, the school committee voted 7-2 to approve a split hybrid model where our teachers split each day between focusing on students in the classroom and also at home. So for the elementary, middle, and high schools, that plan was split hybrid for all of our 3 levels. the recommendation was based on the low transmission rates in Massachusetts and in Newton, which at the time was 0.85%. And it was also based on this really strong desire to have the students meet and connect with their teachers at the start of the year. I voted against that plan because there were so many unanswered questions that would drastically impact the feasibility of the plan's success. Those included huge questions about transportation, funding, staffing, childcare for teachers and childcare for students, because our days were proposed to be a half day. These are complex factors that really would could leave families in a last minute bind if we weren't able to deliver on the model that we were offering. But my biggest objection to that plan was what I described as a two-track system of education in Newton. One in which some students would stay with their peers and their teachers, and another in which other students would have a third-party delivery of education that was through Edgenuity at the high school level. Now, we knew as a district and as a school committee, we knew from a prior survey of our students and families that the large amount of our Black, Brown, and Asian populations were the ones selecting remote options. And we knew that, and that 85% of our families would ended up choosing a hybrid model. So there was disproportionality in the people who would avail themselves of each model. But so even so, that was a recommendation to the school committee, and as a member, as a body, the school committee voted to authorize it, to approve it. 2 weeks later, after surveying families and staff, the district updated its recommendation, and that was really in response to the glaring reality of the fact that we had huge challenges involving staffing and equity, and that those challenges were so large that it really compromised the feasibility of implementing both a hybrid and a distance learning model for our high schools. So NPS had to update the recommendation to a fully remote plan for the high school, and that's where we are now. Fully remote for the high schools. The middle schools will begin the year also remote, and they will phase into hybrid on November 16th at the start of the second marking period. The elementary schools, they will start with a phased in hybrid starting September 16th, this week, and offering students 2 half days of in-person learning and extending that to 2 full days of in-person learning on November 1st, keeping a remote distance option. So how we arrived at that second vote was I drafted a motion with our legal counsel and another member of the school committee that I could live with, that really put a check on whether it was feasible for us to implement the plan prior to presenting it to our families as something that we would do. And so that vote was a unanimous one on August 25th, I believe. Everything seems so long ago now, but that's the plan, and I'm hoping for a good start.
Wow, that's first of all, great work, sticking to your guns and following through for what you thought was the best option. I just wanted to, I kind of lost the sequence of the start date. So at this point, you're doing, it looks like a phased re-entry. High school is fully remote. The middle school is remote up until November 16th. And the elementary school, you were saying starts 9/16. And
So
that entry is, what's middle school for you in terms of grades?
Middle school is grades 6 through 8. And elementary, the K-2 students will start the week of the 16th with in-person. The K to 5, so the entire school will start the week of the 21st for their 2 days of in-person hybrid and then 3 days of remote.
Okay. These plans in so many ways sound very have a lot of similarities. I certainly do appreciate the amount of work it took to get to that. I assume that each of you worked through the summer and nights and weekends to get to these plans. So I commend you for the work. Two things that come to mind is there what's the fallback position if the numbers go up? But I also see that there's a question here. So, well, let me ask this question. And I want you to also think of this as a conversation amongst yourselves as peers. If you want to follow up on what someone else on the panel has said, please think of this as I was going to say confrontational. You've had enough of that. Conversational amongst yourselves. But there's a question out here, and it says, what data do we have? And this is for Cambridge, for all of Cambridge's child care centers. But I think that's a question that should be asked of all of you. Have you engaged? Do you know what's happening in child care centers? I say that I think this is an interesting question in particular, because I know that our district had we call them roundtables with the city council, and part of it wasn't an in-depth around what would daycares do, but there was some conversation around daycares. And so that question's out there. And the other question that's out there is, did you find DESE? I know the federal government was probably even the least amount of help, was what was coming out of DESE helpful? So I posed the child care question first, but you can also lean into, I shouldn't use acronyms, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Did you find them helpful or a hindrance? Because I've heard both sides. Anyone want to jump into the deep end of the pool?
I'll jump in really quickly. It's interesting. One thing I've even before COVID that I've really struggled with as I became a school committee member is every ill that society is manifested when it comes to our educational system. And when COVID hit, that really just got larger, that expectation around a educational system being able to meet the multiple needs of families. And so, this trying to tackle the issue around childcare for families, as well as for our educators, is something that we're really struggling with here in Cambridge. From my vantage point, I only speak for myself. I see our educational system, our main focus is to educate our kids and all of the things necessary as relates to socio-emotional supports that then position our educators to then support our kids through their matriculation and academic attainment. That's really complicated when you add COVID into the mix, because we know how interconnected these systems are. And even from the work that I do outside of being a school committee member, when you look at the marketplace, we are now seeing how the institution of education, private or public for that matter, is really at the cornerstone of keeping our economy going. I do know that the state was more intentional with setting parameters and guidelines for daycare centers as a business than they were for educational institutions or districts across the Commonwealth. So, childcare centers have had guidance for a longer period of time from the state than what schools have. So even when you put that in perspective, it's difficult when one entity has had guidance, and for school committees like myself and my colleagues, we were literally building the plane and flying it at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And just to give context for people around like how these systems interact with each other and how the state really just did not connect those dots, I think is important. But I would love to hear from Andre and Tamika.
Right, either of
Sure.
you. Andre, please.
Sure. I think that's a really good place to build from. So I am an officer in the Massachusetts Association of School Committees, MASC, where I do a lot of work on behalf of urban districts. And what was clear from the moment we got our first guidance on how to reopen, which again was end of June, early July, that the state's interest in opening schools was less about what is best to educate students, although I think we all agree that ideally what's best to educate students is to be in a classroom with a teacher. But what was motivating DESE's and the state's approach to reopening was they wanted kids back in the buildings for childcare purposes. And in particular, they wanted students back in the building for childcare purposes because employees want their employers, their employers want their employees back. And to get there, it was clear that the state was willing to cut corners, right? Like the initial guidance said students only needed to be 3 feet away. And that was not because that was what was safe, but because they recognize that any district like Somerville that says, no, we're going to stay at 6 feet, can't do full reopening because physics is a thing. They can't fit in, they can't all fit in the buildings. And that is frankly how daycares have worked, right? The daycare guidance has been based on the fact that you're simply going to serve fewer students, right? And the economic impacts of that on what is already an underpaid, underfunded industry, I think, at a rate for years. But basically, the state's guidance to daycares was only serve half as many kids. That is not an option that public schools have. And so, to your question about DESE's guidance and how DESE's been a role in this, I'd actually say DESE's been worse than the federal government because the federal government just didn't do anything, right? The federal government has been like, you're on your own, open schools, but we don't care what you do. DESE has routinely offered bad late guidance, right? So they give us guidance that doesn't really help solve the problem, and they give it to us a week late. The classic example, just to really bring this home, is the first time the Commissioner of Education deigned to speak directly with school committee members was scheduled for the day after we were supposed to have approved plans to the state. So we got no guidance and no leadership help from the state on this issue as school committee members. They talk to superintendents on a weekly basis, but as the policymaking bodies that were supposed to make decisions for the district, the state was not there. And when they were there, they gave us advice that only confused issues, clouded things up, angered parents, angered teachers, and didn't actually solve problems.
Thank you. Yeah, the chat box is percolating over here. I got a question here for TAMIKA. So you have a choice. You can lean into the question that's before us now, but another question that's come out of the chat is, as a METCO district, what are the additional considerations and how is Newton supporting the students in the stage reopening? Can you speak to that a bit?
Yes, I can. But first I want to piggyback on what Andre said and just be like, ditto to everything you said. I wholeheartedly agree. Less than helpful and late would be how I describe most of what DESE has put out. And as a new school committee member, I was not at all, I was shocked. I was shocked that this body of education that I previously had such high regard for, that it was giving such little information and such little usable, practical guidance for schools in this huge, momentous thing that we all have to do. So I was disappointed in most of the guidance that DESE put out. To answer the chat question, Newton is the largest METCO participating district. We have over 400 students in our enrollment from Boston resident students. And I think throughout the reopening process, what's been frustrating is that not only our students in the METCO program, but our students of color have been less engaged, less deliberately solicited for feedback or kind of a partnership way of saying what would work for you, and we want to make sure that we're not injuring you or in some way doing harm to this vulnerable group of our students. In fact, I was in a meeting with over 200 METCO families, and our superintendent and a few members of the school committee. And that was the first time that many of the families had had any type of direct opportunity to give their thoughts and share feedback with this plan. That was the day that they had to decide whether they were selecting a hybrid model or a fully remote model for their students. That was egregious in my mind. It should have been, Manikka, when you were talking about this, I think you said it was a task force that Cambridge had put together with resident experts and parents being influencers in the plans that Cambridge was putting together. I thought that was phenomenal, and I wish Newton had something like that, in particular for our Metco families and our families of color. So I'm not quite sure I answered fully that question, but that's just where my head goes.
Yeah, I think that where you leads us to really that elephant in the room conversation around equity with all of this. And even for Cambridge, you know, I think that we all are very well intentioned, right? What's interesting here, we all speak the same language. We will all talk about dismantling white supremacy. We know all the phrases. But at the end of the day, when you look at if you look at the data as it relates to who's doing well in our system and who's not, it's still the same issues that any other school district that don't have the resources and don't speak the language of dismantling white supremacy. Like we're still in the same place. And so for me, even with all the work that we've done, it's still a challenge. And I know for us, when we look at who's choosing in person versus who's choosing to be remote, there is a divide there in our city as it relates to families of color versus non-families of color. And what's interesting about that, our survey data, there was no consensus across all demographics as it relates to which models. But one thing was clear, that regardless of your socioeconomic status as well as your race, more than 50% preferred hybrid and some form of in-person. But it's interesting, you fast forward, we have lower positivity rates, but families of color are not signing up. And so I think the question that I have, you know, we struggle to figure out what's right in the context of education in good times, as Congresswoman Clark mentioned in her intro. We're in horrible times now, and we're all trying to figure out what are the levers that we need to put in place to ensure particularly our most vulnerable are able to learn. I'm a parent, and my deepest fear, I don't want my child not to be able to learn, and particularly how to read, because she's going into first grade, and I know that's a lot of people's struggles right now. And so how are we marrying this conversation around meeting the needs of our young people with these models from the lens of equity?
And Andre's about to jump out of his seat. I see it back there. And on the chat, there is that question I see. It's talking about what's right, what's fair, because some folks want to know, how are we making sure that Black and Brown parents are really getting the information so that they can make the right decisions, they can support their children in the right ways? And that seems to keep appearing. You know, how are we reaching out to families, coupled with where are, at least in Cambridge, and I can't speak for Somerville or Newton, where the opportunity and the academic achievement gap was alive and well, and now it's even worse. How are we getting out to these Black and Brown and linguistic minorities, making sure our immigrant families, how do they make sure their children are educated fully under this model? But Andre, I see you were sort of had your hand up, so please jump right in.
So I'm gonna start with agreeing with Manikka. I also have a daughter going into first grade and is learning to read, and I both don't want to squander that moment, but also I'm afraid, because if I've had a teacher to read, I'm gonna make it a chore, not a joy, which has been my concern with why I haven't pushed as much as I might otherwise. But I think, you know, as far as this has been my struggle, right, for Black families, and you know, in Somerville it's Black and Brown families. They all, like the data's been clear from them. they were the ones most concerned about going back in person. And I get it, right? Like we all seen the data. This is a lose-lose situation for Black and Brown America, right? Like if they go back in, they're the ones most likely to get hit by the brunt of the disease. But remote, which is tough on everybody, is going to be toughest on them. This is going to be a year that is going to almost certain. Like I think the best we can hope to do this year is minimize the growth of achievement and opportunity gaps. Privileged families are going to find ways. They're already starting to do it. Pods and tutors and all these supplements that some families just don't have access to. And so it really is for Black and Brown America a lose-lose situation, right? And as far as what we can tell them, I think this is I think where there's a disconnect, right? Like I can't tell Black and Brown families with a straight face that, oh, it's going to be fine, right? It's not about reassuring them. There are deep system-wide inequities that are going to play out in schools, but are beyond the ability of schools to fix. And that is true no matter what the approach is going into this year, right? Like Somerville's already spent $1 million+ on preparing for starting school remotely, a lot of which has gone towards technology and internet gaps. But we're going to see inequities throughout the system. And as someone who ran for office to attack inequities, that's a hard thing for me to say, but it's the reality. And I'm not going to try to reassure Black and Brown families that their instinct as to my kid isn't going to be safe is wrong, because the data's there. Like, no, if someone in Somerville is going to get sick and die of COVID because schools reopen, it's almost certainly going to be a Black and Brown family. Right? Like the 6 teachers who've already passed away this year, I think 4 of them were Black or Brown. Like these are real inequities that are going to be the case. And I'm not going to lie to parents to get them to do what I want them to do.
So
yes, go ahead,
TAMIKA. Jump in. For me, my family is in the percentage of families that is choosing full remote for health reasons. So we are the 25% of Newton families who are choosing full remote for elementary school. That's over 1,000, I can't remember the exact numbers. Let's see, over 1,243 students. And it's now Newton's 3rd largest school behind our 2 high schools. It is a majority minority school. Newton's only majority minority school. So that raises an interesting question. And for me, that's the question. And that is, how are we going to ensure that this group of students isn't left behind? How are we going to bring this group of students up and give them the supports that they need so that the disparity that was existing last year doesn't just widen? I think that's really, as a school committee member, that's my focus now. This is what we're in. This is what we're doing. We voted on this, we've authorized this, and now it's our obligation to make sure that it delivers for our families. I don't know how we're going to do that, but that's what has to happen.
I want to just jump in because I appreciate the depthness of this conversation, and it reflects the complexities of what school committees have had to grapple with over the past 2 months in a very short amount of time to make these types of decisions. And I want to fully be transparent that there were a cohort of families of color as a coalition here in Cambridge that advocated very hard for remote only, and we landed in a place where it was an opt-in model for our families, so no one would think that anyone's being required to do anything. But that said, I think it speaks to what Andre said so eloquently. I am not pushing one way or another for anyone as it relates to the decisions that they have to make for their household. It is such an intimate decision based on a lot of different scenarios that is unique household to household to household. And whatever decisions people make, I respect them. And as Tamika said, it's now my job to make sure that whether they are in a building or at their homes, that we are able to provide as much as possible a quality education to mitigate, because I believe, Andre, it's no way humanly possible that we are going to stop the tidal wave of academic achievement gap. I wish, I mean, it's why I ran, right? That's why all of us, we ran to stop it, right? But the reality is that we're a part of this really complex system. And so how do we leverage our positions to make sure that whatever choices are being made, that we're able to ensure that kids have what they need, and not just kids, but our educators too, because they're fearful, they're afraid, like we're all really stressed out in this moment. So I just want to affirm my colleagues for just really elevating the conversation, because these are the issues that we're all grappling with as parents and decision makers in our school districts.
I mean, you raised earlier on when I talked about why we had this conversation, we talked about good trouble. We have to have these conversations because we have to figure out those answers. Children's lives are on the line in so many ways. And so again, we have another question that speaks to what happens if the positivity rate spikes? Is there a fail-safe plan? Is there a fallback plan? Have your districts looked at that? And the other question is, and how are school committees from a policy perspective going to ensure that kids that are already starting at a deficit, which are Black and brown children, don't fall further behind? Is there going to be some benchmarking? So I throw that out to our panel, the two questions: positivity rates go up. What are we going to do? Second thing is, how are we going to ensure, this follows up from what you've just been talking about, what are we going to do if we already know that Black and brown children are from, I often said there's two, in education, there's two trains. There's the local, the express, and the local never catches the express. So we're trying to make sure we stay ahead and stay on time. What are we going to do for Black and brown kids to make sure? Because right now they're on the local.
So I can start. So the reality is, this is why Somerville hasn't put out dates for reentry, right? Like, no one knows what the disease is going to look like in October and November. I think it is. I think, and what our experts are telling us is that it's reasonable to assume that there will be a fall spike.
Right.
So we are going from that assumption. We are taking it day by day, and that is why we're saying we don't know when we'll be back in person, is because we don't know what the disease will do, and we're not going to try to give people false hope. In the meantime, as going into this, how do we mitigate, and how do we know we're mitigating this this tidal wave of inequity that's coming our way? Part of it is being deeply intentional. When Somerville created its first MOU, we made sure to make a point that if we can get our buildings ready to go, even if we can just get our English learner students, who are for Somerville the overwhelming majority of people of color, in the buildings, we would try to do that, because we know, especially special ed and English learners, that's hard to do remotely, right? Mm-hmm. We're not going to be able to do that with the quality these students deserve remotely. So the sooner we can get them in the building, the better. We know that we're going to be putting in extra supports. Somerville, we know the data is pretty clear that despite the fact that they are actually the fourth counting white students, the fourth largest group in Somerville students, Black students, African American students, are the students we are serving least well. That was true before COVID. It's going to be true during COVID, and it's going to be true after COVID. So a lot of what we're going to be doing this year is the stuff we would have been doing anyway, right? Like, we've invested heavily in cultural competency trainings. Mm-hmm. We are looking at exploring the possibility of doing during the school day affinity work and revamping our curriculum to have an explicitly social justice lens. It's going to be bringing in outside support. Like, we've invested in bringing in Becoming a Man to both our high school and consulting bases for this year. We're starting in a new building, but also starting in one of our middle schools, the one that serves our poorest and blackest students. It's creating all that system of supports and being very intentional about it is the only chance we have. And then, watching it, although the thing to remember when we try watching this is we have no baseline, right? No one knows this is not a year we have anything to compare it to. No one knows if this is the work that's working relative to being in a pandemic and being in a remote hybrid, whatever we end up doing situation. So it's going to be a lot of trial and error, which is unfortunate. But if people knew how to do this, hopefully we would have done it by now.
Yeah, if I can jump in, everything that you're mentioning is the things that we're doing in Cambridge. I know that in our past budget that when other districts are laying people off, we're hiring diversity, equity off. We're opening up a diversity and equity office within our school district and staffing that. The one thing that I struggle with, and I in school committee meetings I say this, that we have the wraparound supports. We have Becoming a Man. Love that program. It does a great job here in Cambridge. I think that sometimes we get so wrapped up in the wraparound services that's needed for our students that academic educational component at times really get lost. I actually, this may sound a little controversial, but like literally a Black constituent told me, she was like, Manikka, I know the pandemic, is really hard. But people fail to realize that even during slavery, which is probably, one could argue, harder than us living this pandemic right now, people learned how to read to position Black people to be able to survive in a world that was deeply rooted against them. And she was pushing on me. She was like, where is the conversation around academics? I see the conversation around the wraparound services. And, honestly, I just did not have the right answer for her. And I think at times, this goes into a deeper issue. This was before COVID, and we're seeing it during COVID. We need mental health services and like any other community. And I also think that there are moments when sometimes we lean on that more than seeing the God-given potential and intellect that is in every single Black and brown child, because sometimes it's easier to lean on that aspect than to understand what the core function of the institution is, which is educating kids. And you do the wraparound piece to support the academic piece. And I just think that that's an area that we really struggle with here in Cambridge.
I certainly would
Can I
support
respond?
that. I wanted to hear, Tamika, did you want to weigh in on this? We have a couple more questions. You won't believe this, folks. We are supposed to be out of time. But I don't want to stop the conversation. So I want to hear from Tamika. There's a question here for Andre. Let's give it another 5 minutes if you can stay with us. So Tamika, do you want to say something around what your colleagues have said?
Well,
do you have an approach?
I'm hopeful that Newton can leverage some of its public-private partnerships that we have available to us to make sure that that group of students who are doing full remote, and let's face it, even in our hybrid plan, that's still 3 days of remote learning. So it's kind of our remote learning. Let's make sure that our students of color and our ELL students, that they have some of the opportunities to access some of the enrichment that a majority, I would argue that the majority of our families in Newton are putting together for themselves, these educational pods. And so I think it would be interesting for the school committee to kind of to reach out and say, hey, private foundations that we partner with, this is an identified need with a group of folks and we need your help. I don't know that those conversations are happening, but I think they should happen.
And I would certainly agree. I don't think that conversation happens enough. I often say there's only one child. That child's name is all children, which means that everyone's responsibility. And, and this is a conversation even Manikka and I have not had a lot, but it shouldn't be just the sole responsibility, number one, of the school department, because we are all of our towns that are represented, cities that are represented here are considered what I would say wealthy if you look across the Commonwealth. So if we can't get it right, well, I don't have a whole lot much hope for other cities and towns. But we should certainly dig down deeper to find the resources for the Black and brown parents. And that means calling on everyone, as you said, our community partners, our business partners, our universities that are bringing their kids back. Please bring some resources back with those students that you're bringing back to us. I just think we certainly need to drill down deeper in terms of partnerships to support our kids. Clearly. We are at 2:07. We were supposed to stop at 2. So I want to just, there was a question now for Andre, and I want to ask that. And then I want to ask each of you, there's a question that we didn't ask or something that you want to say that didn't get said. So first to you, Andre, the question out here is, how are regional partnerships, Somerville, structured for shared information? So can you share a little bit? Can you wrap your head around that?
Sure. So I would say this is, conversations I've had with my colleagues on multiple occasions, I would say the structural failure of Massachusetts schools that school districts don't share enough information. I would, if I'm being completely honest, I'd go so far as to say Massachusetts school districts are too small. Mm-hmm. So I think, I know that our superintendents talk on a regular basis. I know that I've been part of conversations with school committee members through other towns as we try to, cities and towns, to try to navigate this, but the systems aren't there. It is all based on individual people doing the work themselves. And the problem is you can't build those systems without resources, right? And without time. As a school member in Somerville, I make $17,000 a year. This makes me one of the 10 best school committee members in school committees in the state, the overwhelming majority of whom are unpaid. And so we're asking people to make really hard decisions with day jobs, with, families and lives, and then also asking them to find systems to communicate with other districts without any actual systemic infrastructure, I think is oftentimes just a bridge too far.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer. Thank you so much. So we're rounding the close of our program. I'm sad to say, so Manikka, you and I are gonna have to plan to do this again, the part 2 of this discussion, because this is very rich and informative, I might ask. But is there something that you wanted to say that we did not get out that you think is important to be shared? TAMIKA, Andre, Manikka?
I would just throw out that we didn't cover too much the impact of the twin-demic, the racial unrest and racial justice protests, and how that is impacting this moment on the shoulders of already the crisis that we're globally in with the COVID-19 crisis. I think it was really a 1-2 sucker punch to education at a time when we are so vulnerable to both of the issues. Many school districts like Newton were technology under kind of funded, and we didn't have the systems in place to make what we're doing now a feasibility at the outset. It was really, I think Manikka said, building the plane as you were flying the plane. I've heard that analogy a lot. But the impact of where the protests for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Ahmaud Arbery, where they started, and that just hitting us at a time when we were all just so vulnerable already. And I think for me, as a person who does racial justice it's a huge part of my background and the contribution that I give to my community, it's made a very busy summer even that much busier. And it's really a truism that it's an emotionally hard time right now. And I think that on top of everything is that's the bridge too far for me. So yeah.
But I think you're absolutely right. We did not spend enough time, so we're going to have to come back to have that discussion, maybe just that discussion. But in that context, I think that is why some parents are choosing to keep their children at home. The twin fear of, not only may my child or I get the disease, will I get the quality of care that I need, should I get it? And that's where parents, you know, when I talk to parents, and I don't talk to nearly as many as Manikka does, that's what they're saying to me. You know, can I get the test? If I get the, if I have the virus, what do I do? Because I cannot quarantine because we're already underhoused. And so those are some of the hot button issues that you know, I know your schedules are way busy, but I would love for us to come back, and I'm going to use your term called the twindemic. Let's have a real clear conversation about how it's really impacting us. Because on the city side, when we talk about it, we talk about, you know, and we talk about the issue of housing and how this impacts all of that. We say, how do you tell a family member to quarantine when there are 3 families living in a 3-bedroom? And those kinds of really hard and important questions. So thank you for reminding us that how hard this is, and how hard this is for families of color. Andre, anything that we did not talk in, you want to agree or?
Sure. So first of all, I'm stealing that term twindemic. That is brilliant, and I'm totally going to use it from now on. Thank you for that.
It's not mine.
Well, that's okay.
I'm giving you credit for it because that's where I got it from. But to build on what you're saying, the other thing we didn't discuss, and you know, Manikka touched on it, was how all of this plays out in the politics of this, right? Like, we've hit this convergence, and I'm an optimist, so I actually see this on net a good thing. I think we acknowledge that COVID shows that everything in our system is broken, right? Every flaw in our system, COVID is eliminated. Coupled with, after 50 years, we have white America's attention again, right? Like people say there's a racial awakening. I'm like, no. White America has a racial awakening. This is all stuff we've known has been true for 50 years. But that convergence, while this has been a rough emotional year to be a Black person, especially a Black person in the public space, we have a unique both opportunity and obligation to take this moment where people are open to change and really make change. Like, I think hopefully, as a concrete example, I hope there's some things we all learn from remote learning that we keep going forward, right? Like that we actually don't go back a year or 2 years from now to the way we were educating students even last year, right? Mm-hmm. And I'd love to have that conversation about like, what are the things we're learning from this moment that we can keep and use to actually make progress on racial equity?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Excellent points. Manikka, not to be the last word, but what is something that you wanted to say that we did not get a chance to speak to? And as always, every time we do this program in this series, and we always tell ourselves we're ending the series, we find a reason to continue the series. But Manikka, speak to us. What comes to mind about something that we should have or didn't get to talk to, or something you want to say before we close out this afternoon?
Yeah, for me, I think that this conversation, for, you know, those who are watching and will watch in the future, I think that a lot of times in our public meetings, people don't have the opportunity or the way it's structured, because those are business meetings, public business meetings. Mm-hmm. There's no opportunity to do what we're doing here. So for people to be able to really take a step back from the cliff. One of my favorite sayings is, when you're on the edge of a cliff, progress is not measured by taking a step forward, it's taking a step back. And I feel like this conversation is an insight to school committee members and the push and pulls and challenges that we have that may not manifest itself in the structure of a business meeting, but people have the opportunity to see the care and nuances that the people that they elected to serve them, they're putting in the time and the work. And so for that, I am so incredibly grateful. And I would love for Andre and Tamika to come back. So I'm just saying it now. You're going to get an invitation. We're going to do part 2 of this, and we're going to keep the conversation going, because I think it's really important. And in the context of Cambridge, I think that these are all really unique, individualized decisions that all of our families are going to have to make. And as I said earlier, my commitment, and I can't speak on behalf of my colleagues, but I feel comfortable saying this, that they are all very much so committed to meeting the needs of our families, regardless of where we may fall on different issues, is why all of us ran. And that is going to be our commitment during this very challenging and turbulent times. And I want to end on a positive note that say that it's going to be hard, but we're going to get through it. There will be light at the end of the tunnel. There will be something on the other side. I don't know what it will be, but I agree with Andre that we cannot go back to public education the way it used to be. And whatever I can do in my role at the local level, at the state level, and I'm very grateful for Congresswoman Clark seeing the need to be in conversation at the local level with school committee members in the way that she has, to say that she's committed even at the federal level. And I know that all of our delegation is, to ensure that this conversation is front and centered. So I just want the people of Cambridge to know that we're committed.
Thanks, Manikka. You know, this has been a great program. It's a great way to come back. The chat box was firing. We didn't get to not all the questions that were there. So that tells you that this is a conversation that people do want to have and want to participate in. So I just want to say thank you, first of all, to my colleague for doing something that we don't usually do, which is reaching across the aisle. You know, we work in silos so often. Somerville is Somerville, and Cambridge is Cambridge, and Newton is Newton, and on and on and on. When we're all doing the same work, all in the same way, and an opportunity for us to get together and talk as colleagues around important issues is extraordinary. So I really applaud Manikka for coming up with the idea, but I'm going to reach out to you as well and say, look for us in your inbox, not with a thank you, but when are you available? Let's continue the conversation, because you know, again, Tamika, it may not have been your word, but it was the right word. How do we just address this issue of the twindemic and its impact on our community? So thank you first, but I'm going to look forward to having this conversation with you again. To our Congresswoman KATHERINE Clark, I want to thank her. To CCTV, who gives us this platform to have this conversation every other Saturday, to reach out to the community and really have those discussions that are really about good trouble. And then also to our viewers, thank you for joining us every other Sunday as we dig deep into these important issues to really to work toward making a better society. You're right, we can't go back to what we've had. I often say, when people say, I can't wait us to get back to our new normal, I say, I don't want new normal, I want different. I want things to be different than they were before we got ourselves here, so that when we come out on the other side, we're a lot better. Looking forward, I hope folks will join us on the 27th as we have a conversation around what is policing in our community. As you know, across the country, everyone is talking about how we police and what does that look like for people of color. So I'm hoping those that are viewing this today will join us on the 27th, and then shortly thereafter, we may be having a conversation, the second installment of reopening schools, the twindemic. So as we close, again, thank you to everybody. And I want to read a quote from Ron Edmonds, because I think it speaks very specifically to what needs to be done and what we're trying to do. And he said this in 1970, we can, whenever and wherever we choose, successfully teach all children whose schooling is of interest to us. We already know more than we need to do this. Whether we do it or not must finally depend on how we feel about the fact that we have not done so thus far. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you on the 27th. But until then, be good to yourselves and to each other. Good afternoon.